Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening, as always. This is part 11 of our series on the Korean War, entitled The Path to Peace. So, here we are finally. The 11th episode of the Korean War series is here, and what's more, as it turns out, this will not be the last. When I began working on the script for the series again in September, I realized that if I was to include everything that I wanted to discuss in one episode, it would have ended up being well over 2 hours long. So for the sake of brevity and coherence, I've decided to split the script for this final part into 2 episodes. This one will cover the final year of the war, the continuing armistice negotiations, and the various obstacles that stood in the way of the peace process. The actual implementation of the armistice agreement and the immediate reactions to it will be covered in the 12th episode, along with a discussion of the war's long-term effects on a local, regional, and global scale, and a comprehensive retrospective on what we've covered over the course of the entire series. Assuming that everything goes according to plan and I'm able to release this episode sometime in mid-October, you can expect the final one to come out about a month from now. One important note is that, for the sake of maintaining continuity in the catalog, the release of this episode has been backdated to April 6th, 2024, which was when it was initially slated to be released. This means you probably did not receive a notification from Spotify or whichever other podcast listening platform you use that this episode has been released, but if you're listening to this now, I'm assuming you were able to figure that out anyway. The same will be true for the next episode as well, so keep an eye out for it again sometime in mid-November, more than likely the 14th or 15th. If you've been listening to the current series on the Marquis de Lafayette, you should know that those episodes will continue to be released according to the usual bi-weekly schedule. You may want to listen to the housekeeping announcements that I make at the beginning of those episodes for updates as well. Once more, I'd like to apologize for all the confusion and delay that has occurred with this series. It is my hope that this won't happen again in the future. And so, without any further ado, let's start the show. In the previous episode of our series on the Korean War, we made a diversion from the main narrative to take a more in-depth look at the prisoners of war during this conflict. Where we left the narrative in episode 9, it was about May 1952. The war in Korea was a month away from hitting the 2-year mark. Since June of the previous year, the battlefront, which up to that point had been highly fluid, became stagnant. From about this time until the war concluded in June 1953, the military situation in Korea devolved into a situation that many commentators likened to the First World War, as hundreds and thousands of men fought and died in trenches and bunkers, and all of this for some seemingly insignificant territorial gain. In Chapter 31 of his book, This Kind of War, author T.R. Fehrenbach describes the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, that took place between September and October of 1951, and in doing so outlines the general pattern that would characterize many subsequent battles during the stalemate, such as the Battle of Triangle Hill, the Battle of Jackson Ridge, the Battle of Porkchop Hill, and so on and so forth. Quote, "For 27 days, the 23rd Infantry assaulted Heartbreak. They took knobs only to lose them. They took stretches of hill but could not secure the ridge. All the while, the KPA reinforcements streamed in from the north. A new pattern, one that would characterize most of the following battles in the hills, was being set. On the disputed terrain, generally a small area, the fighting was hell itself. Artillery fire, such as the world had never seen, was massed against single hills day in and day out. Because of the limitation of the battleground, units were committed piecemeal and were quickly cut to shreds and immediately replaced. A few miles to either side of the disputed hill, the front lay quiet and brooding. Routine activity carried on. And beyond the regimental headquarters, no one would even have known that there was a war going on. Action of this kind was contrary to previous American military doctrine. The solution would have been to hit the enemy elsewhere, to knock him off balance and to punch through. But the United Nations Command had no authority to put this kind of pressure on the enemy across the entire line. They had no authority to reopen the wholesale fighting because the United Nations did not want military victory. They wanted a truce. And the enemy was perfectly willing to fight to the death over some insignificant piece of ground for what seemed like forever. The fought-over hills assumed propaganda values, entirely out of proportion to their strategic worth. It was like a children's game of King of the Hill, played with blood and bullets. Whoever lost a hill, lost face." End quote. Moving on to the battle's conclusion, Fehrenbach discusses the emotions felt by the Americans who fought in this engagement, and suggests why Heartbreak Ridge was given the name by which it went down in history. Quote, "By October 15th, the 2nd Division's maneuvers had broken the back of the defenses on Heartbreak Ridge. The KPA 3rd Corps that had held the ridge was rendered unfit for action. Between the casualties it suffered there and at Bloody Ridge a month prior, they'd lost 35,000 men. But once atop the ridge, the men of the 23rd could see far out as 10 miles north. They saw mile after mile of dark hills that gradually grew higher, hills where thousands more Chinese and North Koreans were no doubt lying in wait. It was a long, long way to the Yalu, and these men knew in their hearts that they were not going there regardless of how many hills they took. An officer, writing an official battalion history, summed up their feelings. The will to fight, though not gone, was not the bright light that it had once been. On the 25th, the men who'd taken Heartbreak Ridge came down off the hill, replaced by the 7th Infantry Division. The real heartbreak lay not in the dead and maimed, of whom there were some 5,600, many still wedged in bunkers and crevices where they fell, but in what they had accomplished by it all." End quote. As these feelings of frustration, despondency, and a growing sense of the futility of everything started to take hold over the men on either side of the front lines, equally intense feelings flared up between the opposing delegations at Panmunjom. In fact, the tiny, heretofore insignificant village was no one's first choice when it came to choosing a site to host the armistice negotiations, but after the first round of talks ended abruptly in August 1951, the Communists agreed to relocate the venue for talks from Kaesong to nearby Panmunjom, which UN officials considered to be a more neutral location. But although the Communists were willing to make this concession, they were not quite as accommodating when it came to the other issues of the day. The first major disagreement arose regarding the ceasefire line, specifically as to whether it should correspond to the pre-war border between North and South Korea, or if it should be drawn along the battle lines where they were at the time the armistice would go into effect. The two sides squabbled over this question for weeks until the latter proposal was finally adopted. When it came to the next item on the agenda, the prisoners of war, the debate became far more contentious, and in the previous 2 episodes, we've attempted to determine exactly why this was the case. To briefly summarize once again, the Geneva Convention of 1949 stipulated that, following the conclusion of an international conflict, all foreign nationals held prisoner by enemy belligerents should be repatriated to their nations of origin. However, some influential figures within the United Nations coalition did not think that this was an advisable or desirable course of action. They instead proposed that the POWs be allowed to decide for themselves on an individual basis whether or not they wanted to be repatriated. This principle of voluntary repatriation appeared to be a solution to the concerns, both humanitarian and practical, that many UN decision-makers had with the whole prisoner exchange issue. The challenge now lay in convincing the Communists to agree to this proposal, which would be no easy task. Their delegation firmly rejected the idea when it was first proposed, but softened their stance when the UN agreed to conduct a screening to determine the number of POWs in their custody who would choose to be repatriated. When the results of the screening revealed that only slightly more than half were willing to return home, the Communists once again voiced their disapproval of the plan. By this juncture, however, the UN considered themselves morally and ethically committed to this principle of voluntary repatriation, as they were unwilling to forcibly return thousands of self-identified anti-communists to communist countries. In this way, negotiations reached another impasse in April 1952. The UN unequivocally rejected proposals to implement a ceasefire while negotiations were ongoing, which meant that while these negotiators were bickering and arguing at Panmunjom, thousands of more soldiers on both sides were being sent to their deaths on the hills and ridges of Central Korea, as described earlier. With casualties steadily mounting and the prospect of victory seeming ever more distant by the day, public opinion in the United States turned decisively against President Harry Truman, as many had come to feel that these men, their fathers, brothers, husbands, and others, had died for nothing. The president's approval rating dropped to 22% by February 1952, which to this day remains the lowest recorded approval rating of any president since these opinion polls began to be conducted. A letter written to the president by one Donna Cooper, a grieving mother who'd lost her son in the war, reflects the growing discontent. Quote, "Dear Mr. President, Today I buried my firstborn son. Having known the depths of his soul, I can find no place among his memories for this purple heart. I am returning it to you with this thought. To me, he is but a symbol of the 100,000 men who have been sacrificed in this needless slaughter, a so-called police action that is not and could never have been satisfactorily explained to patriotic Americans who love their country and the ideals that it stands for. None of us appreciate the degradation and the ridicule that we have to suffer because of this pseudo-war. If there had been need for an armed conflict to preserve the American way of life, I would have given him proudly, and would have respected the medal. But since there was nothing superficial in his whole life, I cannot mar his memory by keeping him medal and stereotyped words that hold no meaning and fail to promise a better tomorrow for the ones he died for." End quote. Even officials within the U.S. State Department had begun to voice the opinion that continuing the war was futile. On September 15, 1952, the Assistant Chief of Staff reported, quote, "It appears that within current capabilities and existing policies, there are no military courses of action that will ensure a satisfactory conclusion to the Korean struggle." End quote. Truman's term as president was to expire in January of the following year. It was clear to political observers that the war in Korea was the foremost issue on the minds of the American public, and that the upcoming election of November 1952 would essentially be a referendum on the war and the current administration's handling of it. Truman, to his credit, sensed the way the wind was blowing and decided not to seek re-election despite being eligible. The Democratic Party's nomination instead went to Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. His opponent from the Republican Party was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had previously served as the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during World War II, and was instrumental in leading the Allies to victory over Germany. This reputation led the American public to believe that he would do a better job handling the war in Korea than Truman had. Eisenhower addressed the issue directly in a speech that he gave on October 25th. Quote, "The first task of a new administration will be to review and re-examine every course of action open to us with one goal in view: to bring the Korean War to an early and honorable end. This is my pledge to the American people. For this task, a wholly new administration is necessary. The reason for this is simple. The old administration cannot be expected to repair what it failed to prevent. Where will a new administration begin? It will begin with its president taking a simple, firm resolution. The resolution being to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War, until that job is honorably done. That job requires a personal trip to Korea. I shall make that trip. Only in that way could I learn how to best serve the American people in the cause of peace. I shall go to Korea." End quote. This speech was received quite well by the American public, with many political commentators crediting it with having guaranteed Eisenhower's victory in the election, which we will discuss shortly. Eisenhower's decision to run for the presidency inadvertently led to a shakeup of the command structure of the UNC. In May 1952, Eisenhower formally retired from active military service to focus on his political campaign. By doing so, he also resigned his post as the Supreme Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In need of an experienced military figure to lead the alliance in its formative phase, General Matthew Ridgway was asked to take the job. This, of course, meant that somebody else had to replace Ridgway as the Commander-in-Chief of the UNC, and as the Commander of Allied Forces in the Far East. He recommended his old friend and classmate, General Mark W. Clark, as his replacement. Both Ridgway and Clark commanded troops during the Italian campaign of World War II, and after the war, Clark served as the military governor of the American zone of Allied-occupied Austria. Since the Soviet Union also occupied a portion of the country during this time, Clark's interactions with his Soviet counterparts had given him a good deal of experience in negotiating with communists, though he did not hold them in particularly high regard. In his own words, quote, "The communists respect only one thing, force," end quote. Evidently, he kept this thought at the forefront of his mind when he assumed his new command on May 12th. Around that time, it appeared that the armistice negotiations were about to stall out once again as a result of the UN's screening of prisoners in their custody and the subsequent uprising at the UNC prison camp on Gyeonggi-do that we discussed in the previous episode. General Clark, who sought to take a more aggressive and proactive approach to his position than his predecessor, thought that the communist provocations could not go unanswered. A massive show of force was needed to chasten the enemy and to pressure them into resuming talks. Since proposals to expand the UNC's ground forces with Chinese nationalist troops from Taiwan were roundly rejected by his superiors, Clark's options were somewhat limited. What he could do was loosen certain restrictions on the Air Force that had been in place since the war began. North Korea's power grid was, and remains to this day, heavily dependent on hydroelectricity. As of 2022, it's estimated that hydroelectricity accounts for 80% of North Korea's energy production. At the time of the war, this number was probably closer to 90% or even higher. This power was generated by 6 different systems, each of which consisted of a series of 4 hydroelectric dams. The chosen reservoir, or Lake Changjin, the site of the climactic battle between the PVA and the US Marine Corps in December 1950, was a part of one of these hydroelectric power systems, but the largest and most important power installation in the north was the Suiho Dam, now called the Supong Dam, on the Yalu River. Originally constructed by the Japanese, the Suiho Dam was the 3rd largest hydroelectric dam in the world at the time it was completed in 1943. This dam and others like it were obvious targets for the U.S. Air Force's bombing campaign. All of these power stations were included in a list of potential targets drawn up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the onset of the war. However, the JCS designated them as off-limits for attack. This was for a few reasons. For one, early in the war, when the reunification of Korea was still the primary objective of the UNC's mission, the JCS advised that infrastructure deemed to be of long-term importance should not be targeted. Secondly, the power stations on the Yalu River, including the Suiho Dam, did not only provide electricity to North Korea, but to much of northeastern China as well. Therefore, the JCS, ever wary of provoking China, prohibited its pilots from operating within a certain distance of the Chinese border, making the Yalu River dams off-limits. These restrictions were, as you'll recall, a major source of contention between General MacArthur and his superiors in Washington, D.C. In March 1952, as a renewed diplomatic stalemate at Panmunjom appeared likely, bombing the North's hydroelectric power plants was again proposed as a way to pressure the communists into compliance. Ridgway refused to order such attacks, since he did not think the current situation warranted it. By the time General Clark took over his command 2 months later, things had changed somewhat. The negotiations did in fact stall out again, and in early June, Clark had his Air Force generals draft plans to attack the hydroelectric facilities. President Truman, at the recommendation of the JCS, gave his authorization on June 19th. The operation took place over the course of June 23rd and 24th. It was the largest aerial mission undertaken by the UNC during the war, in terms of the number of aircraft involved rather than the tonnage of munitions used. Between 500 and 600 aircraft, belonging primarily to the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Naval Aviation Corps, were mobilized. Because the targets were all located far to the north, the mission's planners had to take into account the possibility of counterattack by communist air forces. Precautions were taken accordingly. For one, all sorties were flown under the cover of darkness, as had been standard procedure since April of the previous year. Secondly, the B-29 heavy bombers were not used, as they had been shown to be easy prey for the communist MiG-15 fighters. For this mission, a number of fighter models, including the F-80 Shooting Star, were refitted to serve as bombers. 6 squadrons of F-86 Sabres, the only model of aircraft with capabilities on par with the communist MiG-15s, were also deployed to provide cover. During the raids, though, no enemy aircraft made an attempt to intercept the bombers. It is not clear why this was. The Soviet Air Force commander was most likely caught unprepared at the time of the initial attack, and was unable to organize an effective response in time. The official U.S. Air Force records claim that American pilots did spot a large number of MiG-15s, around 160, taking off from the forward airbase at Antong. They most likely thought the airbase itself would be the target of the attack, and were trying to escape further north. In any event, the only resistance that UNC pilots encountered during this mission were anti-aircraft flak cannons placed near the targets. These were responsible for the loss of 5 American planes in total. The mission could hardly have gone better for the UNC. 13 of North Korea's major hydroelectric facilities were targeted for destruction, with the greatest priority being placed on the Suiho Dam. According to the official report of the U.S. Air Force, 11 of 13 targets were completely destroyed, and the remaining 2 plants were heavily damaged. As a result, North Korea suffered a total power blackout, lasting about 2 weeks. But even with the limited use of their remaining hydroelectric facilities, the country's power generation was reduced to only 10% of its former capacity for the rest of the war. In the following months, the UNC would seek to capitalize on their success by conducting further strikes on the North's remaining power infrastructure. This included another raid on the Suiho Dam in mid-September, although by that time the communists had reinforced their anti-air batteries near the facilities, rendering the bombing less effective. In fact, reconnaissance photographs indicated that 2 of the 6 generators within the Suiho hydroelectric complex remained in operation as late as October. Now the question must be asked. Did these attacks have the intended effect of putting pressure on the communists to expedite armistice negotiations? The answer, it appears, is no. On July 11th, a little over 2 weeks after the North's power grid was knocked out of commission, the UNC carried out a series of bombing runs on the North Korean capital city of Pyongyang. 1,400 tons of conventional explosives and 23,000 gallons of napalm were dropped on the city in a matter of hours. Professor Haruki Wada claims that the level of destruction was unparalleled in modern history. Quote, Pyongyang was completely destroyed. In fact, no capital city had been bombed so intensively. Soviet aircraft and anti-aircraft units were utterly ineffective. Pyongyang was as defenseless as Tokyo had been in the final months of the Pacific War. End quote. Between 4,000 and 7,000 were killed in the latest round of attacks, which were intended to really hammer home the message that the UNC wished to send to the North Korean leadership. In fact, Chairman Kim Il-sung was quite perturbed by these attacks, as evinced in a message he dispatched to Joseph Stalin requesting more anti-aircraft equipment. Quote, During the year of negotiations, we have, in effect, ceased combat operations and shifted to passive defense. In this situation, the enemy has suffered virtually no losses, and continuously inflicts enormous human and material losses on us. For example, the enemy recently disabled all of Korea's power plants, and it is impossible for us to restore them due to aggressive American aerial attacks. The enemy takes advantage of this situation in the negotiations to thrust unacceptable demands at us. End quote. A short time later, Kim wrote to Mao Zedong suggesting that they yield to the Americans on the prisoner of war issue. Mao rejected the idea on the grounds that such a concession would be a show of weakness. Aware that he was in no position to argue, Kim acquiesced. In August, a Chinese delegation headed by Premier Zhou Enlai visited Moscow to meet with Stalin. Bringing the Soviet leader up to speed on the situation in Korea, Zhou explained that the battlefront was stable and that the communist forces were capable of holding their current positions for the foreseeable future, though the prospect of resuming offensive operations appeared dicey. The discussion then turned to the armistice negotiations and the POW issue specifically. Zhou claimed that the communists held the upper hand in the negotiations. The Americans wanted the war to end, and for that reason, he went on, the communists should not make any concessions on the POWs. To this, Stalin pushed back somewhat, insisting that it would be perfectly reasonable to agree to some sort of compromise with the Americans. Elaborating further, he suggested that the issue could be tabled for future discussion, perhaps mediated by a neutral country after a ceasefire went into effect. Zhou was not totally opposed to such an outcome, but he stated that China was preparing for the possibility that the war could be prolonged for another year, perhaps even longer. In this event, more military assistance from the USSR would be necessary. Stalin restated his promise that he would provide as much aid as he could, but he also expressed concern about the toll that the war was taking on the Koreans themselves. Quote, North Korea will suffer losses in this war, but they will not be defeated. It is necessary to persist and endure. Of course, we must understand their position. They are suffering huge losses. We must persuade them that this is a momentous undertaking. They must have fortitude and persevere, but we must continue to support them. End quote. Stalin then inquired as to the current disposition of the North Koreans and their leadership. Zhou reported, quote, There is much destruction in Korea, especially since the bombing of the hydroelectric power plants on the Yalu River. This has adversely affected the spirit of our Korean comrades, and has made them want to attain peace faster. Overall, the Koreans are a little unsettled. They've lost confidence and resolve, and a part of the leadership is panicking. End quote. Stalin was wary of a rift forming between the Chinese and North Koreans. In order to forestall any sort of open break between the two, he made arrangements to meet with Kim Il-sung and his vice chairman Pak Han-young. This meeting took place in Moscow on September 4th. Peng Dehuai, the commander-in-chief of the PVA-KPA Joint Headquarters, was also invited to attend, along with Zhou Enlai and a few other Chinese diplomats who were still in the Soviet Union. Stalin began by once again inquiring as to the mood of the Korean people. Kim's response was positive, albeit with a large caveat. Quote, "The overall situation is favorable, if you do not include the bombing raids." End quote. Stalin expressed his sympathy for the North Koreans' plight and promised to fulfill Kim's earlier request for more fighter divisions and anti-aircraft artillery. Then, rather bluntly, Stalin broached the more pressing issue of the day, asking both Kim and Pak, quote, "They say that you Koreans have some sort of disagreement with the Chinese as to how to conduct negotiations with the Americans. Is that correct?" End quote. Kim's response was carefully worded to emphasize a unity of purpose with China, while simultaneously expressing a desire to bring about a quick end to the fighting. Quote, "In my opinion, there are no serious conflicts of opinion. We have agreed to the proposals set forth by our Chinese comrades. But taking into consideration the grave situation in which the Korean people find themselves, we are interested in signing the armistice as soon as possible. I am certain that our Chinese comrades are also interested in that." End quote. In summary, the bombing campaign did unnerve the North Korean leadership and made them more desirous of a truce, but ultimately this was a moot point. As we discussed in previous episodes, the North Koreans by this point had long been relegated to a supporting role in military and diplomatic affairs. The Soviets may have sympathized more with them, but so long as the Chinese remained in charge of the military and diplomatic conduct of the war, the North Koreans' considerations would continue to be deprioritized. So to rephrase the rhetorical question I posed earlier, if the escalation of the bombing campaign in the summer of 1952 did not, in fact, induce the communists to adopt a more conciliatory stance at the armistice negotiations, what did it accomplish? The answer here appears to be not much. Disabling North Korea's power grid may appear to be a big achievement, but strategically speaking, it did not perceptibly alter the balance of power on the front lines. In the immediate term, the primary consequences of these bombings were a renewed round of criticism directed towards the US by its allies, chiefly the United Kingdom. This criticism stemmed less from any moral or ethical concerns about attacking the hydroelectric plants, but from the Americans' failure to consult with their allies before carrying out such a mission. Secretary of State Dean Acheson issued an apology, and the entire issue was quickly papered over. Around the same time, though, a rift was also growing between the South Koreans and their foreign benefactors. In the Republic of Korea's temporary capital of Busan, a political crisis was in the making. In episode 9 of this series, I spoke at some length about the outlook of ROK President Syngman Rhee on Korea's future. Eisenhower's presumptive nominee for Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, gave a rather succinct assessment of Rhee and his ambitions. Quote, "President Syngman Rhee is old and feeble, but his will is still powerful. He has two main obsessions. One, to remain in power, and two, to unite all of Korea under his leadership." End quote. It was for the second reason that Rhee made no effort to hide his opposition to the armistice negotiations, and why he may have been behind a partisan attack on the Kaesong neutral zone that resulted in the talks being suspended for several months. The South Korean political crisis that came to a head in May and June of 1952 stemmed more from Rhee's ambition to remain in power than it did from his desire to reunite Korea. In short, Rhee's proclivity towards heavy-handed political repression and the corruption endemic within his administration had made the president increasingly unpopular with the National Assembly, the legislative branch of the South Korean government. In previous episodes, we talked at length about events like the Jeju Uprising of 1947, the Bodo League massacre in the summer of 1950, and the December massacres, also in 1950. However, the events that threatened to precipitate an open break between the president and the legislature were two that occurred in February 1951, those being the Jiochang massacre and the National Defense Corps incident. The first of these, the Jiochang massacre, occurred in the context of the ongoing counterinsurgency campaign being waged by the ROK Army against communist guerrillas behind UN lines. It took place on February 11th, when a unit of the ROK Army rounded up and killed over 700 unarmed civilians in Gyeochang County in South Gyeongsang Province. The National Assembly received word of this crime and demanded that Defense Minister Shin Sung-mo open an investigation. Shin made a gesture of compliance, but subsequently engaged in cover-up efforts. The official report from the investigation, released in April, claimed that only 87 communist collaborators had been executed, and that all had been fairly tried and convicted by a military tribunal beforehand. This explanation did not convince anyone, and National Assembly members called for the ministers responsible for the attempted cover-up to be sacked. Bowing to pressure, Ri dismissed 3 members of his cabinet, including Defense Minister Shin. Ultimately, Shin was reinstated a short time later at the request of ROK Army leadership, and the other 2 received a presidential pardon. The already strained relationship between Ri and the National Assembly was strained even further in June when a report from an investigation into an entirely different matter was made public. On December 11, 1950, President Ri promulgated a law authorizing the conscription of 500,000 able-bodied men between the ages of 17 and 40. These men would be organized into something called the National Defense Corps, which was conceived of as a separate armed force complementary to the standing army. The underlying rationale was to counter the human wave tactics of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army by directly emulating them. Some 400,000 men were mobilized in the first months of 1951, which was around the time the Communists captured Seoul. These hastily conscripted recruits were ordered to march to various training locations in the south, but in the chaos ensuing from the fall of Seoul, the units became disorganized and leaderless. Not to mention they did not receive any uniforms or rations of food. Thousands of them died of starvation and exposure, and thousands more deserted. The report published by the Investigative Committee in June found that between 50 and 90,000 had died in such circumstances between December and February. The reason why they had not received adequate supplies, the report concluded, was because nearly all the funds that were meant to be allocated to the Corps had been misappropriated. Some 1 billion won had been embezzled, with a significant percentage ending up in President Ri's political fund. The National Assembly voted to abolish the Corps. The report recommended, quote, "The culpable officers should either commit harakiri or be executed," end quote. Harakiri, of course, being ritual suicide. The government attempted to downplay the scale of the corruption, pinning the blame on just 11 National Defense Corps officers. The following month, 8 of these men were court-martialed, of whom 5, including the Corps commander Kim Yu-gun, were sentenced to death by firing squad. A number of more powerful figures implicated in the scandal managed to escape justice entirely. These events caused Ri's working relationship with the National Assembly to break down at a time that could hardly have been more disadvantageous to the president. According to the 1948 Constitution, Ri's term as president was set to expire in July 1952. The problem was that the Constitution also stipulated that the president was elected by the National Assembly. When it became apparent that the National Assembly would not support his bid for re-election, Ri tried to amend the Constitution to arrange presidential elections on the basis of a popular vote. Further complicating matters was the fact that constitutional amendments required a 2/3 majority vote of the National Assembly. When the legislature roundly rejected the amendment when Ri initially proposed it in January 1952, the president tried to inflame popular sentiments against them. In a speech given at a rally in February, he argued that the assembly was defying the will of the people and called for those assemblymen who had voted against his amendment to be removed from office. In response, Ri's opponents in the assembly drafted an amendment of their own, one that would abolish the presidential system and make the chief executive accountable to the legislature. As the stage was being set for a major political confrontation in the coming months, John Muccio, the American ambassador to the ROK, sent a report to Washington, D.C., quote, "Ri is becoming increasingly recalcitrant and senile. While he is the president, no one else seems to have the guts to stand up to him. Of his potential replacements, most seem pretty crummy from our point of view," end quote. Muccio figured the candidate most amenable to American interests was the Prime Minister, the head of government and second most powerful figure in the ROK government, Chang Myon. Muccio said he believed the best-case scenario would be Chang being elected president by the National Assembly and Ri being subsequently iced out of power, but he warned that Chang's close ties with the United States may prove to be a liability if American interference in the election was perceived. Ri was evidently aware of Washington's preference for Chang Myon, so he dismissed him as prime minister in April, but Ri was running out of time. Election season was quickly approaching. Then, in May 1952, as the eyes of the world were turned toward the uprising on Kyoje Island, the old president saw his chance. On the 14th, he reintroduced his proposed constitutional amendment to the National Assembly. He did not expect them to approve of it, but he did use this as a distraction to maneuver 2 of his loyal allies, Chang Taek-sang and Lee Byung-suk, into the offices of Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior, respectively. His power thus having been shored up, on midnight of May 24th, Ri declared martial law in the provisional capital of Busan and adjacent counties. Several prominent members of the opposition in the National Assembly were arrested on spurious charges of being accessories to a communist plot to overthrow the government. Fearing for his safety, former Prime Minister Chang Myon fled to the U.S. Embassy, where he was granted political asylum. Meanwhile, Rhee's operatives staged pro-Rhee demonstrations throughout the city. Large crowds, numbering in the thousands, congregated outside the building that housed the National Assembly, loudly proclaiming their allegiance to the president and demanding that the legislature approve his constitutional amendments. Rhee announced his support for the protesters and allowed them to continue gathering in large numbers despite the standing curfew. These developments were all greatly concerning to Rhee's American benefactors. 3 days after martial law was declared, General James Van Fleet, commander of the 8th Army, met with President Rhee, requesting an explanation of recent events. Van Fleet told the president that, quote, "The measures that have been taken might reflect unfavorably on the ROK government and could cause the outside world to lose confidence in it," end quote. Moreover, he said that the decision to declare martial law was ill-advised from a military standpoint, as diverting large numbers of South Korean troops to the Busan area would only diminish their strength on the front lines. E. Allen Leitner, the official in charge of the U.S. Embassy while Ambassador Muccio was out of the country on business, was present at this meeting and wrote a memorandum summarizing Rhee's response. Quote, "Rhee countered that a group of gangsters controlled the majority of the National Assembly, had connections with the nation's enemies, and planned to seize the government. He maintained that he had acted to save democracy in Korea. The president is determined to rid himself of his enemies at any cost and is indifferent to foreign criticism. Stronger action now seems required," end quote. The following day, the United Nations Commission on the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, or the UNCURK, issued Rhee a formal request that he end the state of martial law and release the imprisoned National Assembly members. A short time later, the U.S. government issued a statement of their own, reiterating that from the UNCURK. The only immediate effect of these statements was to hinder Van Fleet's efforts to work out a compromise between Rhee and the opposition. According to Leitner, Rhee became furious at what he characterized as the interference of the U.S. and the UN in South Korea's internal affairs. On one level, Rhee's charge that the National Assembly was trying to remove him from power was correct, although by not re-electing him as president, they would have been acting within their constitutionally delegated powers, and it is doubtful that these efforts were the product of a secretive communist conspiracy as he claimed. Whatever the case was, the extreme measures he took to remain in power ultimately did cause the formation of an actual, more credible plot to overthrow him. Leitner claimed to be in contact with a cadre of ROK Army officers who were planning to stage a coup d'etat against Rhee. The plot never came to fruition, though, and since the matter was never subject to a formal investigation, the details, including the identities of the conspirators, are unclear. Curiously, one suspect was the director of the Army's Intelligence Bureau and his deputy, a 35-year-old Army colonel named Park Chung-hee. Park, for those unaware, would eventually become the president of South Korea after seizing power in a 1961 military coup. Back to the matter at hand, though, Leitner recommended forcing Rhee to step down before he could nullify the results of the upcoming presidential election. He also asked General Mark Clark to have Rhee placed under house arrest. Clark, however, was hesitant to take such a drastic action unless it was deemed a military necessity. For the time being, he said, every effort should be made to pressure Rhee short of directly involving the U.S. military. Leitner pointed out that Rhee's actions were liable to critically undermine UNC morale. Quote, "We cannot ignore such developments behind the front lines, in a country which was being defended by the collective action of many democratic countries, in a cause that was fighting for the very principles of constitutional government, human rights, and freedom." End quote. President Truman voiced similar sentiments in a letter he wrote to Rhee on June 3rd. Quote, "It would be a tragic mockery of the great sacrifices in blood and treasure which the people of the world's free nations and of Korea have made in the past 2 years if any changes considered necessary to the political structure of the ROK cannot be made in accordance with the due process of law." End quote. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., State Department officials and the Joint Chiefs of Staff met to decide how the situation should be addressed. All present agreed that open military intervention was undesirable under the present circumstances. Rhee may have had powerful opponents in the National Assembly and in the ROK Army Officer Corps, but he still had the support of the South Korean public. An open break with Rhee had the potential to cause intensified popular unrest in the South and to significantly demoralize the ROK Army, which, by this point in time, made up 60% of UN personnel on the front lines. Ambassador Muccio drew the following conclusions, quote, "There must be some leadership in the ROK government. It appears that this leadership can be best provided by Rhee, albeit under some controls and in a more chastened mood. It appears here that the US and UN interests would be best served if Rhee were to remain president." End quote. This ultimately was the consensus in Washington, D.C. regarding the situation in South Korea, but there also was an agreement that the US should only continue to support Rhee if he cooperated with them in restoring political stability. Failing that, contingency plans should be drawn up for the US military to step in and take control of the situation. Ambassador Muccio returned to Korea later that month and immediately began meeting with key figures in the ROK government to find a way to end the crisis. However, as soon as Rhee understood that the US was not going to withdraw their support in the immediate term, he felt only more emboldened to act against the opposition. On June 21st, one of his allies in the National Assembly introduced another bill to amend the Constitution to allow for the direct election of the president. A number of opposition leaders subsequently held a demonstration in protest and were attacked by an angry mob while the police stood by and watched. On July 1st, with mere weeks remaining before Rhee's term as president was set to expire, a special session of the National Assembly was convened. Once again, a vote was to be held on the proposed constitutional amendments, but this time, thanks to a combination of bribery and threats, the assemblymen fell into line, with all those present, 123, voting in favor. However, the resolution could not be passed since this was 10 votes short of the two-thirds majority needed. To remedy the situation, Prime Minister Chung had the police search the Capitol for assemblymen who failed to report to the session. 33 of them were located and forcibly taken to the Assembly Hall, along with 7 of the assemblymen who had been arrested back in May. They were not permitted to leave until a final vote was taken, which finally occurred on the evening of July 4th. 160 voted in favor of the amendment, and while none voted against it, 3 abstained. And with that, Rhee had eliminated the final legal obstacle preventing him from remaining in office. Presidential elections were held on August 5th, with Rhee winning an overwhelming victory, securing over 70% of all votes cast, and although historians have noted significant irregularities in the election, it's uncertain if these actually changed the result. But although he had no way of knowing it, Rhee was not completely out of the woods yet, so to speak. At the height of the South Korean political crisis in late June and early July 1952, General Clark had his staff draw up a detailed plan to remove Rhee from power. In documents that were declassified in the 1970s, sometime after Rhee's eventual overthrow and death, a number of different scenarios were outlined. The most ideal of these envisioned a unilateral action on the part of the UNC, that is to say, with the minimal involvement of local collaborators. The plan went along the following lines. Rhee would be invited to Seoul or otherwise lured away from Busan. Once he was out of the temporary capital, UNC personnel would move in, take control of martial law from the ROK army, and arrest 5 to 10 ROK government and military figures identified as Rhee's closest allies. Rhee would then be informed of these events as an accomplished fact. He would be told to issue a proclamation lifting martial law, allowing the National Assembly complete freedom of action, and guaranteeing basic freedom of the press and of assembly. In the event that he refused to do this, he would be placed under house arrest indefinitely, and his deputy, Prime Minister Chang Taek-sung, would be told to sign the proclamation. If he also refused, at that point the UNC would be forced to step in directly and implement a UN military government until such time that civilian rule could be restored. The initial draft of these plans was codenamed Operation Ever Ready and was presented to the State Department on July 5th, the day after the National Assembly voted to approve the president's proposed constitutional amendment. Although these plans now existed, Clark remained reluctant to implement them, and in a memo to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he reiterated that he would only act in the event that, quote, widespread disorders affecting my mission break out, end quote. By his mission, Clark was of course referring to the prosecution of the war. He also expresses confidence that the political situation in South Korea would stabilize now that the amendment had passed. Later that month, Rhee did in fact begin to take actions indicating his willingness to continue cooperating with the U.S., lifting martial law, pardoning the assemblymen who were arrested in May, and dismissing some of the more hardline members of his government, like the Army's Chief of Staff Yi Chong-chan and Vice President Lee Byung-suk. Events had largely played out the way that General Clark had predicted. The option of overthrowing the South Korean president had been weighed, but in the end, it had been determined that the potential negative consequences of this action were too great to be worth the risk. And so, now that Ri was working to mend his relationship with the United States, the two settled back into their uneasy but functioning relationship. Certain that Ri was liable to cause more problems in the future, though, Clark had the plans for Operation Ever Ready to be filed away for future reference. To fast forward a few months and bring our narrative up to November 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower won the presidential election in the United States, defeating his opponent Adlai Stevenson by an overwhelming margin, winning 55% of the popular vote and carrying 39 out of 48 states. Several factors contributed to this result: dissatisfaction with the Truman administration and the Democratic Party, Eisenhower's massive popularity stemming from his reputation as a war hero, and the use of highly effective publicity tactics by the Eisenhower campaign, among other things. But the single most important issue of the 1952 election, and the most relevant for our purposes here, was Eisenhower's stance on the Korean War. Eisenhower's "I shall go to Korea" speech that he gave on October 25th, that I read earlier in this episode, is often credited with securing his victory. It's worth emphasizing, however, that Eisenhower merely promised to end the war, and at no point detailed any substantive proposals as to how this might be accomplished. His political opponents criticized him for his ultimately vague position on the issue, but this ambiguity may well have played to his advantage, as anyone could read into his statements whatever they wanted. Very soon after the election, the president-elect announced his intention to travel to Korea before the end of the month. It's uncertain at what point Eisenhower decided on what course of action to pursue vis-a-vis Korea, though there is evidence to suggest that he had already done so well before he took office, even before his much-vaunted trip to Korea. According to JCS Chairman Omar Bradley, a longtime friend and associate of Eisenhower, quote, "Ike was well informed on all aspects of the Korean War, and the delicate nature of armistice negotiations. He knew very well that he could achieve nothing by going to Korea," end quote. This is supported by claims made by Generals Clark and Van Fleet, both of whom stated that they were prepared to discuss military strategy with the president-elect during his visit, but that no such discussions took place. Again, based on this, we can reach the conclusion that Eisenhower's visit to Korea was essentially a publicity stunt, as he was achieving little but fulfilling a campaign promise. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that Eisenhower would seek to end the war by diplomatic means rather than military action, seeing as how the armistice that ended the war was concluded 6 months after he took office. At the time, though, and especially in the period between the election and Eisenhower's inauguration in January 1953, there was a widespread perception that the exact opposite was true, that the Eisenhower administration would pursue more aggressive action in Korea. This held true not only abroad but in the United States as well. For instance, General Clark, whose desire to end the conflict by military means has already been noted, thought it would be best to wait for the results of the election before advancing any proposals for the further buildup of UNC forces and the resumption of offensive operations. It also appears that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and State Department anticipated a significant change in strategy once the new administration took over. In Europe and the countries of the British Commonwealth, the news of Eisenhower's victory in the presidential election was met with a sense of general unease. America's allies in the United Nations coalition were, by this point, wary of the United States' continued prioritization of Asia over Europe in the global struggle against communism. In particular, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose past relationship with Eisenhower was at times contentious, expressed concern at this development, telling an aide, quote, "I think this makes war far more probable," end quote. Nor were these concerns limited to the United States allies. Mao Zedong's advisors told him that Eisenhower would likely escalate the conflict upon taking office. Their analysis suggested the most likely scenario was a large-scale amphibious landing behind the front lines, similar to the Incheon operation. Mao concurred, and he sent new orders to PVA Deputy Commander Deng Hua in December 1952 to shore up coastal defenses in anticipation of a naval invasion. In a message sent to Stalin on the 17th, Mao spoke about this scenario as though it were an inevitability, quote, "With the truce talks suspended and American casualties not yet on a scale that would compel them to halt military activities, in the spring of 1953, the new administration will resume the offensive. Eisenhower is planning for military operations in Korea to be taken immediately upon his inauguration," end quote. Stalin, on the other hand, was not fully convinced of this, but he did not discount the possibility entirely, as his response to Mao 1 week later shows. Quote, "It is very possible that the Eisenhower administration will move towards ending tension in Korea, yet it is always best to assume the worst-case scenario and prepare for a U.S. offensive." End quote. The South Koreans also believed that Eisenhower wanted to bring the war to a victorious conclusion. President Truman may have decided that Korean reunification was no longer feasible, but Eisenhower might be convinced to take up the mantle once more. President Rhee voiced these sentiments in an interview with the New York Times shortly after the election. Quote, "I expect General Eisenhower to bring peace and unity to Korea. We are depending on him." End quote. Naturally, the president-elect's upcoming visit to the country assumed great importance. It was an opportunity for the South Koreans to win him over by demonstrating their great devotion to the cause of unification. President Rhee made preparations to give Eisenhower a grand reception during his visit to the country, with mass rallies, parades, and a state dinner. This, all despite having been told that the president-elect would make no public appearances during the visit for security reasons. In fact, Eisenhower's advisors had explicitly cautioned him against meeting with Rhee, or, if a meeting could not be avoided, to at least discuss political matters as little as possible. Eisenhower's visit would be rather short, only 3 days in total, from December 2nd to the 5th. His time was spent entirely touring the front, observing conditions on the ground and speaking with officers and enlisted men. On the 4th, a massive rally was held in Seoul to welcome the president-elect to the country. Thousands of citizens turned out, waving American flags and holding banners with messages, written in large English letters. Eisenhower declined the invitation. ROK Army General Paik Sun-yup later recalled these events with a mixture of disappointment and fury. Quote, "President Rhee sat on the stand and waited for the Americans to change their mind, and for Eisenhower to show up. I accompanied the president, and he was shaking from the cold as some 100,000 Seoul residents waited in bitter winter weather, standing in the plaza in front of the Capitol building. We waited for Eisenhower, but he never came." End quote. Rhee attempted to hide his anger at this insult, but General Paik was absolutely furious, later writing, quote, "Whatever their real reasons were for not meeting with Rhee, this dealt a severe blow to the prestige of a sovereign head of state." End quote. General Paik telephoned Clark, telling him on no uncertain terms that Eisenhower's refusal to meet with Rhee was a grave affront to Korean dignity, and that if a meeting was not arranged immediately, future cooperation between the American and South Korean governments was in jeopardy. The message had its intended effect. The Americans were sufficiently alarmed, and Eisenhower delayed his departure the following day to meet with the South Korean president. It lasted for just 40 minutes in total, and though the atmosphere was highly tense, nothing of any consequence was discussed. Before boarding his flight back to New York, the president-elect gave a press conference in which he hinted at how he planned to address the situation in Korea. Quote, "It is unlikely that we will achieve a positive and definite victory without running the grave risk of enlarging the war, but America will see it through." End quote. Again, vague statements like this allowed people to interpret Eisenhower's intention in any number of different ways. Syngman Rhee came away from his meeting with Eisenhower convinced that he could still be persuaded to support unification. Whatever it was he had in mind prior to the visit, Eisenhower claimed that this experience helped clarify things. Quote, "My conclusion as I left Korea was that we could not stand forever on a static front and continue to accept casualties with no viable result. Small attacks on small hills will not end this war." End quote. He was committed to a negotiated ceasefire as the only realistic way to end the war. The task that lay before him now was to find a way to break the deadlock at Panmunjom. On the evening of December 5th, as Eisenhower was flying back over the Pacific Ocean, disgraced former General Douglas MacArthur announced in a public speech that he had devised his own plan to end the war, and that he was happy to discuss his proposal with President-elect Eisenhower if he so desired. These two had a long history, dating back to the 1930s, when Eisenhower served as an aide to MacArthur, who was 10 years his senior. Their relationship had oftentimes been contentious, but although he'd had his disagreements with MacArthur in the past, Eisenhower thought it was worthwhile to hear what his former superior officer had to say. A meeting was arranged for December 17th in New York City. It took place behind closed doors, but details were publicized by MacArthur sometime later. MacArthur had prepared a lengthy memorandum that he presented the broad outline of to Eisenhower. The main points were as follows. Firstly, MacArthur contended that in order to end the war, it would be more expedient to open negotiations with the Soviets rather than continuing to deal with the Chinese and North Koreans. As to what kind of deal may be struck, MacArthur suggested that Korea, and perhaps also Germany, could be permitted to reunify under whichever form of government their people chose, with the neutrality of both countries being guaranteed by both the US and USSR. If an agreement along those lines could not be reached, MacArthur proposed a more audacious plan, which he described in greater detail in an interview a decade later. Quote, "It would have been our intention to clear North Korea of enemy forces. I would have dropped between 30 and 50 atomic bombs strung across the neck of Manchuria. Then I would have introduced 500,000 Chinese nationalist troops at the Yalu. As we advanced north, we would spread behind us, from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea, a belt of radioactive cobalt, which has an active life of between 60 and 120 years. For at least 60 years, there could not have been another land invasion of Korea from the north." End quote. Eisenhower did his best to humor MacArthur, listening intently and keeping his replies polite but non-committal. Quote, "General, this is something new. I'll have to look at the understanding between ourselves and our allies in the prosecution of this war." End quote. Eisenhower later said that he came away from his meeting with MacArthur feeling that his time had been wasted. Quote, "He didn't have any formal peace program at all. What he talked about was tactical methods by which the war could be ended." End quote. Eisenhower's reaction seems rather tame considering that MacArthur's proposal had the potential to end human civilization as we know it. To us in the present day, MacArthur sounds like a genocidal maniac, but at the time people did not think of nuclear weapons in the same way that we do now. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the only instances of nuclear weapons being deployed in warfare. I'm sure that to most of my listeners, especially the younger ones, the prospect of nuclear war is absolutely unthinkable, and this is because in the nearly 80 years that have passed since the end of World War II, concerted efforts have been made by the international community to limit the creation and proliferation of nuclear weapons. At that time, though, things were obviously quite different. Nuclear technology was quite new and developing at a rapid pace. When Eisenhower said that this was something new, he was being sincere. His qualm with MacArthur did not stem from a refusal to countenance the use of nuclear weapons, but because to him the plan seemed impractical. Likewise with Truman, the dispute that had led to MacArthur's dismissal had not arisen because Truman was unwilling to press the button, as they say, but because he felt he could not trust the general's discretion. The use of nuclear weapons was under consideration throughout the war, and on a few occasions, the president came very close to giving his authorization, but ultimately decided against it. After he took office in January 1953, Eisenhower was faced with the same decision. In the first months of the new administration, the anticipation of renewed offensive operations prompted another round of debate among the upper echelons of the American political and military apparatus pertaining to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, that is to say, a low-yield, short-range nuclear explosive intended to be used on the battlefield in place of conventional ordnance. Such devices had been in development since 1951, and the project entered the testing phase in early 1953. Months earlier, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a memo which stated that the current nuclear policy should be reevaluated in the light of progress being made on the development of tactical nuclear weapons, but it appears that the tests did not yield promising results, as they subsequently expressed doubt as to whether these weapons would be effective against the well-entrenched enemy positions across the front in Korea. Nonetheless, these measures were still being debated as late as March 31st, during a meeting of the National Security Council. The following account of this meeting comes from the State Department's official historical record. Quote, "President Eisenhower raised the question of atomic weapons in the Korean War. Admittedly, he said, there were not many good tactical targets, but he felt it would be worth the cost if through the use of atomic weapons we could, 1, achieve a substantial victory over communist forces, and 2, push back the military demarcation line. The President and Secretary Dulles were in agreement that somehow or other, the taboo that surrounds the use of atomic weapons would have to be destroyed." End quote. Once again, the President spoke about using nuclear weapons with a surprising open-mindedness. On other occasions, Eisenhower expressed the exact opposite opinion, that the benefits would not outweigh the risks, and of course, the fact that he ultimately did not resort to using nuclear weapons counts for something. In the end, we may never determine whether or not Eisenhower would have pressed the button, and this remains a controversial topic to this day. The most prevalent view among historians is that his strategy was to use the implied threat of nuclear war to intimidate the communists into conceding to U.S. demands and moving the negotiations along. During a state visit to India in May 1953, the new Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, reportedly told Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru that, quote, if the armistice negotiations collapse, the United States will probably make a stronger rather than lesser military exertion that may well extend the area of conflict, end quote. Dulles had intended for Nehru to pass this message, with its nuclear implications, to the Chinese. Although it's uncertain whether or not the Indians did transmit the message, in any event, the Chinese appear to have been well aware of America's nuclear capabilities and their ongoing deliberations about unleashing them. They were seemingly unmoved by the threat. In a conversation with an Indian diplomat, Chinese General Ni Rongjian reportedly said, quote, the Americans can bomb us. They can destroy our industry, but they cannot defeat us on land. They may even drop atom bombs on us. So what? End quote. The main reason why the Chinese felt that they could dismiss this latest nuclear threat as mere bluster on the Americans' part was because it came 2 months after they had made diplomatic overtures to the UNC to resume armistice negotiations. This was a rather sudden change, considering that the negotiations had been more or less deadlocked for nearly a year by that point. How then can this development be explained? What induced the communists to return to the table? As I just suggested, the threat of nuclear war can be ruled out, as can the perceived threat of the new administration's more aggressive military policy. Rather, this change can be attributed to the fallout from the death of Joseph Stalin on March 5, 1953. For quite some time, the conventional view, at least among Western historians, was that Stalin's influence was the main reason that the communists refused to seek compromise with the UN, and that with him out of the picture, they were now free to do so. This reasoning is based on the notion that Stalin wanted the war in Korea to continue indefinitely for 2 reasons. Firstly, a prolonged conflict would require the United States to continue diverting increasing amounts of resources to East Asia, thereby giving the Soviets a free hand in Europe and potentially causing a rift between the US and its European allies. Secondly, the continuation of the war would increase the dependence of both China and North Korea on Soviet aid, thereby keeping both of them firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin's earlier correspondence with Mao and other Chinese officials mentions the former rather explicitly, but as we've seen earlier in this episode, in the final months of his life, Stalin had changed his tone somewhat, encouraging Zhou Enlai to consider adopting a more conciliatory stance in negotiations with the Americans. If anyone in the communist camp wanted the war to continue indefinitely, it was the Chinese, not the Soviets. To be more precise, the Chinese still had confidence in their ability to continue fighting, and as a result they were disinclined to make compromises in order to negotiate a ceasefire. That said, Mao and others were well aware that their capacity to make war was dependent to a large degree on continued Soviet assistance. It was not so much that Stalin wanted to prolong the war indefinitely, as it was that he was willing to continue lending support to the communist war effort in Korea indefinitely. Once he left the stage, though, this support was no longer ironclad. In the first days and weeks following Stalin's death, a great many things were thrown into doubt, especially because he had not designated anyone as his successor. Western observers predicted a power struggle among the Soviet leadership would ensue, and that this may lead to internal conflict and the destabilization of the Soviet Union. These predictions turned out to be only partially accurate. There was indeed a power struggle, one that would not be fully resolved for another 3 years to come. However, this did not escalate into a civil war, nor did the conflict begin immediately. In the immediate term, senior members of the Communist Party's Politburo assumed collective leadership of both the party and the state, with the most important figures being the Premier, Georgy Malenkov, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Lavrenti Beria, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, and Party Secretary Nikita Khrushchev. The new Soviet leadership quickly tried to assuage Western concerns regarding how Stalin's death would affect Soviet foreign policy, especially in regards to Korea. In the speech he delivered at Stalin's state funeral on March 19th, Malenkov took the opportunity to address the wider world and called for the relaxation of international tension and rapprochement with the capitalist powers. Quote, "There is not one disputed question that cannot be resolved by peaceful means on the basis of mutual understanding between the countries concerned, including the United States of America." End quote. The Soviets made a number of diplomatic overtures to the West in the following days, and on March 19th, only 2 weeks after Stalin's death, the Council of Ministers adopted a resolution announcing their intention to work towards a resolution of the Korean conflict. quote, "The Soviet government has thoroughly reviewed the question of the war in Korea under the present circumstances and with regard to the entire course of events of the preceding period. As a result of this, the Soviet government has reached the conclusion that it would be incorrect to continue the line on this question, which has been followed until now, without making those alterations in that line which correspond to the present political situation and which ensure the deepest interests of our peoples, those of the USSR, China, and Korea, who are interested in a firm peace throughout the world and have always sought an acceptable path towards the soonest possible conclusion of war in Korea." End quote. The text of this resolution was included in official communiques to Pyongyang and Beijing. Vice Foreign Minister Vasily Kuznetsov was tasked with delivering the messages in person. Meeting with Kim Il-sung on March 29th, Kuznetsov reported that, quote, "Kim listened to our presentation and was very excited. He said he knew it was good news and that he was very happy. He looked at the documents carefully and asked to meet with us again the next day." End quote. Zhou Enlai, who had attended Stalin's funeral, informed Chairman Mao of the Soviet resolution upon his return to Beijing in advance of Kuznetsov's arrival. There's no record of Mao's immediate reaction, but it is difficult to imagine that he was as pleased with this news as his North Korean counterpart. The conclusion of a peace agreement would almost certainly require China to concede on the POW issue, which was something that Mao was willing to prolong the war to avoid doing. But Mao also knew that to break with the Soviets at this time was not possible, given the degree to which China relied on their assistance. So he quickly fell in line, issuing new instructions to Zhou Enlai to issue a statement, agreeing to the proposal put forth the previous month by UNC Commander Mark Clark for the two sides to exchange sick and wounded POWs pending the conclusion of armistice negotiations. Zhou's statement also indicated the desire of the communists to resume the talks at Panmunjom, and included a new proposal regarding the POWs, quote, "Both sides to the negotiations should undertake to repatriate immediately after the cessation of hostilities all those prisoners of war in their custody who insist upon repatriation, and to hand over the remaining prisoners of war to a neutral state so as to ensure a just solution to the question of their repatriation." End quote. The communist new position, which was not a total acceptance of the UNC's, nonetheless constituted a significant concession on their part. The most straightforward explanation of the Soviet peace initiative is that the new leadership thought it prudent to de-escalate tensions with the Western Bloc during this transitional period. However, there remained a degree of skepticism in Washington as to whether there were ulterior motives at play here. General Clark suspected that these diplomatic overtures were little more than a ploy to dupe the Western powers into letting their guard down before a renewed communist offensive. Similarly, Secretary of State Dulles thought that even if an armistice agreement was reached, conflict was likely to resume after the new Soviet leadership felt that their domestic political situation was secure. For his part, President Eisenhower approached the issue with more of an open mind. He instructed Clark to work out the details of the exchange of sick and wounded prisoners, remarking, quote, "We should use this business as a sort of test of good faith on the part of the communists." End quote. On April 16th, Eisenhower delivered a speech that served as a sort of response to the Soviet peace initiative. In it, he contrasted the United States worldview with that of the Soviet Union and expressed his hope that a just and lasting peace may still be forged in the post-World War II world. It is one of the most famous speeches of Eisenhower's presidency and is unofficially known as the Cross of Iron speech, for the following passage, quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, from those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 people. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This, I repeat, is the best way of life to be found on the road the world is taking. This is not a way of life at all in the truest sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." End quote. Further on in the speech, Eisenhower indirectly addressed the Soviet government, stating that he would consider their gestures towards reconciliation as sincere only so long as they were backed by concrete actions, the most immediate of which would obviously be the conclusion of what he referred to as an honorable armistice in Korea. The speech concluded, quote, "So the new Soviet leadership now has a precious opportunity to awaken, with the rest of the world, to the point of peril reached, and to help turn the tide of history from it. Will it do this? We do not yet know. Recent statements and gestures of Soviet leaders give some evidence that they may recognize this critical moment. We welcome every honest act of peace. We care nothing for mere rhetoric. I know of only one question on which progress waits. It is this: what is the Soviet Union ready to do? Whatever the answer may be, let it be plainly spoken. Again we say, the hunger for peace is too great, the hour in history too late, for any government to mock men's hopes with mere words and promises and gestures. The test of truth is simple. There can be no persuasion but by deeds." End quote. Eisenhower's The Chance for Peace speech was well received both in the United States and abroad, its most significant effect being assuaging the fears that his administration would escalate the war in Korea. The exchange of sick and wounded prisoners that had initially been proposed by the UNC and accepted by the Communists sometime later was scheduled to take place on April 20th. Representatives of the two sides worked out the details of the exchange earlier that month. Codenamed Operation Little Switch, the exchange took place at the Panmunjom neutral site over the course of about 2 weeks. It's not clear what criteria either side used to determine who was sufficiently sick and or wounded to be eligible for exchange, but in total, the UNC returned 6,670 communist prisoners, while the communists returned 684 UNC and South Korean prisoners. This may appear to be an uneven deal, but the number of prisoners exchanged during Operation Little Switch were roughly proportional to the total number of prisoners held by either side, in both cases around 5%. While this exchange was still ongoing, negotiations for an armistice resumed at Panmunjom on April 26th. At the beginning of the proceedings, the senior communist delegate, North Korean General Nam Il, submitted a 6-point proposal regarding the repatriation of remaining POWs. The plan called for all prisoners who voluntarily chose to return home to be repatriated within 2 months. Those who did not choose to be repatriated would be transported to a neutral country where they would be held for a period of an additional 6 months, during which time representatives of their nations of origin would be permitted to speak with them in the hopes of persuading them to return. Those who changed their minds and agreed to return home would be allowed to do so immediately, while a diplomatic conference would be held to deliberate what would be done with those who remained. Lieutenant General William K. Harrison, who replaced Vice Admiral Charles Turner Joy as the head of the UNC delegation before the negotiations were suspended the previous year, took issue with a couple of the points in the new communist proposal. Specifically, he felt that 6 months was an excessive amount of time, and that physically moving the non-repatriates to a separate country was unnecessary. General Nam countered that it was necessary to ensure that the process was fully impartial. Harrison was not swayed. He rejected the proposal as, quote, neither reasonable nor constructive, end quote, and he warned the communist delegation that, quote, we do not intend to become involved in protracted and useless arguments, end quote. The UNC did not object to the idea of a neutral nation, or a group thereof, being designated as the custodians of non-repatriate prisoners, but disagreements arose as to which countries were to be chosen. A revised proposal put forward by Nam Il on May 7th listed the names of 5 countries to form a repatriation commission: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Switzerland, Sweden, and India. The new proposal also reduced the period of custodianship to 4 months from the previous 6. The UNC negotiators, while acknowledging that the communists were still acting demonstrably more cooperative than in the past, still took issue with their most recent proposal as it was currently laid out. More significantly, they were apprehensive about a ceasefire going into effect without the POW issue having been fully resolved. General Clark cautioned his superiors in Washington that, quote, it contains provisions that could work to the detriment of the UNC and involve the U.S. in difficulties with the ROK government, end quote. Clark anticipated that the South Koreans would object most strongly to Korean non-repatriates being taken from the country, and so the UNC counterproposal accepted most of the points of Nam Il's revised proposal of May 7th, but stipulated that the non-repatriates should be released on the same date the armistice went into effect. When the Communists rejected this term, the UNC acquiesced somewhat, and on May 25th, Harrison made a new offer, essentially accepting the May 7th proposal, albeit with some slight alterations. And so, by June 1953, as the 3-year anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War approached, an agreement that would halt the conflict appeared to be imminent. As General Clark later recalled, quote, "Despite some minor annoyances, progress towards an armistice appeared to be rapid. None of the disagreements that still existed appeared too difficult to overcome." End quote. There still did remain one major factor that might complicate things. Although the Republic of Korea was not party to the armistice negotiations, General Clark nonetheless met regularly with President Ri to provide updates regarding the talks. As Clark reported, Ri became quite distraught at the news that he received. Quote, "My relations with South Korea's venerable, patriotic, and wily chief of state had been excellent right up to the moment that the United States indicated clearly that it intended to go through with the armistice that might leave his country divided. After that moment, I became a whipping boy for his bitterness and frustration." End quote. In early April, as it was becoming clear that significant progress was being made in armistice negotiations, Ri communicated to Washington, D.C. by way of the South Korean ambassador to the United States that he would accept an agreement ending hostilities only on the following conditions. Quote, 1. The reunification of Korea. 2. The withdrawal of all communist Chinese forces from Korea. 3. The disarming of North Korean forces. 4. Prevention of any outside country providing arms to North Korean communists. And 5. The affirmation of ROK sovereignty over all Korea. End quote. From this, it is clear that Ri never abandoned his goal of reunifying Korea by military means, even long after the UNC determined that this outcome was no longer realistic. More concerning to his Western allies, he had even indicated in a letter to President Eisenhower that in the event a ceasefire agreement was signed that permitted communist forces to remain in Korea, the ROK army was prepared to continue fighting by itself. Quote, "We will ask that all the friendly nations whose armed forces are now fighting with us in Korea, but who do not desire to join with us in our determination to defeat communist aggression and drive to the Yalu River, to withdraw from Korea." End quote. The Americans were fully aware that the South Koreans could not realistically hope to continue fighting and win the war without their assistance, and therefore assumed that Ri was bluffing. What the Americans perhaps failed to realize was that Ri's refusal to countenance the continued division of Korea was not simply megalomania on his part, but a view that was shared by a significant portion of the South Korean public. Demonstrations against the armistice had been occurring in the South since the talks first began 2 years prior, and had recurred with growing intensity each time they were resumed, with the most recent round, that began in April 1953, being the largest and most disorderly. Centered primarily in Seoul and Busan, the protesters vehemently denounced the potential armistice, their demands being summarized by their most popular rallying cry, quote, "Unification or death," end quote. Some protesters even vented their frustration by clashing with American troops and attempting to storm the U.S. Embassy in Busan. In early June, Eisenhower wrote a letter to Ri urging him to cooperate. He stated that while he sympathized with his desire to reunify his country, the time had come to work towards that goal through diplomatic means. The armistice being negotiated would, as Eisenhower pointed out, leave the ROK in possession of most of the territory it held before the outbreak of the war, and that the communists were willing to abandon their ambitions to conquer the South. He also agreed to negotiate a security treaty whereby the U.S. would continue to guarantee South Korean independence. His letter concluded, quote, "Even the thought of a separation between the United States and the Republic of Korea at this critical hour would be a tragedy. We must remain united." End quote. Eisenhower received no immediate reply. What happened next would stun the world. In the pre-dawn hours of June 18th, at the UNC's main POW camp near Busan, a mass breakout occurred. ROK Army soldiers killed the camp's floodlights and cut the barbed wire fences. Thousands of prisoners, evidently with advanced knowledge of this plan, streamed out of the compound and into the surrounding countryside. The relatively few American military policemen on duty that morning were under orders to open fire only in self-defense. They struggled in vain to stem the human tide with tear gas, as the South Korean guards looked on indifferently. In the next few hours, similar breakouts occurred at 3 other POW camps, at Wonju, Masan, and Daegu. The prisoners held in all of these camps had been previously identified as anti-communists during the screenings conducted the previous year, and had been transferred to the mainland after the Gyeonggi-do uprising. More than 25,000 prisoners escaped custody that morning, and an additional 2,000 followed suit the next day. American and other UNC military police attempted to round up the escapees, but only managed to recapture less than 1,000 of them. The ROK soldiers, far from doing anything to help their allies in their manhunt, instead gave assistance to the fugitives, helping them find food and shelter. Announcements from the government radio station in Seoul instructed all South Korean citizens to do the same. Quote, "The anti-communist Korean prisoners have been released. The entire population of the Republic of Korea is asked to protect and aid these patriotic men." End quote. To clear up any confusion as to what had just taken place, Ri immediately claimed responsibility, stating that he had unilaterally ordered the release of these prisoners. Though he did not state as much outright, his purpose in this had unmistakably been to sabotage the armistice negotiations. Ri's deception provoked anger on the Americans' part. Eisenhower accused Ri of, quote, "sabotaging the very basis of the arguments that we had been presenting to the Chinese and North Koreans for all these many months. In agreeing that prisoners should not be repatriated against their will, the communists had made a major concession. The processing of the prisoners was observed by representatives of both sides. The condition was negated in a single stroke by Ri's release of the North Koreans." End quote. The American president dashed off a sternly worded message to his South Korean counterpart, quote, "Persistence in your present course of action will make it impractical for the UN command to continue operating jointly with you under the conditions which would result therefrom. Unless you are prepared to immediately and unequivocally accept the authority of the UN command to conduct present hostilities and bring them to a close, it will be necessary to effect another arrangement." End quote. Indian Prime Minister Nehru voiced similar concerns before the UN General Assembly. Quote, "In view of Ri's action, armistice terms have now become unrealistic, and the United Nations has been put in a most embarrassing position, which will undoubtedly affect their credit and capacity for future action. Furthermore, Chinese and North Koreans can, with reason, object to the signing of armistice terms which had not been and are not likely to be carried out. As a result, the position of the United Nations Command in Korea becomes completely anomalous, and the question arises whether United Nations policy must be subordinated to that of President Ri." End quote. It was not just the communist potential response to Ri's provocation that the Americans were concerned with. The South Korean president had been known to be uncooperative in the past, but this latest incident cast doubt on the ability of the US to keep Ri in line going forward. In a message to General Clark, Ri made it clear that he was fully intent on further defying the United States' will in the event of a ceasefire. Quote, "According to the terms of the armistice, the armies on both sides shall drop back by 2 kilometers, but the ROK army will not be permitted to withdraw alongside Allied forces. Personally, I hate it like a poison to tell you that I should have to take away command of the ROK army from you, but with things standing where they are, there seems to be no alternative." End quote. In light of these recent events, the plans that had been drawn up the previous July to remove Ri from power, Operation Ever Ready, were revised. The Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized General Clark to, quote, "take whatever steps you deem appropriate to safeguard the security and integrity of UN forces in the event that the present ROK government cannot be forced to accept the armistice terms." End quote. However, Clark remained reluctant to put these plans into action for fear that open conflict would break out between UNC and South Korean troops. As the Americans debated how to address the situation, an undaunted Ri continued to inflame public opinion in South Korea against the armistice. On the occasion of the 3rd anniversary of the war, June 25, 1953, Ri delivered a fiery speech at an anti-armistice demonstration in Seoul. Quote, "What we want, because we know we will die if we follow our allies, is to be given the opportunity to fight for ourselves. We simply ask to be allowed to decide our own fate." End quote. In the hopes of averting a complete severance of relations between the US and the ROK, American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles wrote an impassioned plea to the South Korean president, urging him to cooperate with the UN and invoking the sacrifices that the United States and other allied nations had made on behalf of their cause. Quote, "Dear Mr. President, I speak to you as a friend of your nation. As you know, I have long worked for a free and united Korea. In 1947 and again in 1948 in the United Nations, I initiated the United States steps which led to the establishment of your government and international acceptance of the proposition that Korea ought to be free and united. I pledged our nation's continuing support to that goal. Also, because aggression was an ever-present threat and your people were alone, I asserted that free world unity was a reality, and I concluded, you are not alone. And you will never be alone so long as you continue to play worthily your part in the grand design of human freedom. That pledge of unity was hailed throughout South Korea. It was quickly put to the test, for within 6 days the aggressor struck. Within a few hours, the brave army of the Republic of Korea was overrun by superior forces, and your territory was overrun. You pleaded for the help of the free world, and it came. The United Nations acted, and the United States responded quickly and in large proportion to its appeal on your behalf. We responded because we believed in the principle of free world unity. The principle of unity cannot work without sacrifices, as no one can do precisely what he wants. The youth of America did not do what they wanted. Over 1 million American boys have left their homes and families and their peaceful pursuits to go far away to Korea. They went because at a dark hour, you invoked the sacred principle of free world unity to save your country from an overwhelming disaster. Your nation lives today not only because of the great valor and sacrifices of your armies, but because others have come to your side and died beside you. Do you now have the moral right to destroy the national life which we have saved at so great a price? Can you be deaf when we now invoke the plea of unity?" End quote. Fears that Rhee's actions might lead to the suspension of armistice negotiations were assuaged somewhat in the following month, when a letter signed by both Kim Il-sung and Pang De-hwai reached General Clark. The letter unequivocally denounced Syngman Rhee for violating the terms of the POW agreement, but still announced the communist dedication to concluding an armistice. Quote, "Although our side is not entirely satisfied with your reply, yet, in view of the indication of the desire of your side to strive for an early armistice, and in view of the assurances given by you, our side agrees that the delegations of both sides meet at an appointed time to discuss the question of implementation of the armistice agreements and the various preparations prior to the signing of said agreement." End quote. On June 18th, Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of the National Security Council to discuss what should be done to address Rhee's duplicitous actions. Some of America's allies had already issued calls for Rhee to be removed from office. An article that appeared in the British publication The Daily Mail mused, quote, "Rhee's treacherous and insolent act has brought up a simple but all-important question. Who is to be in charge of South Korea? The United Nations or Syngman Rhee? If an armistice fails to materialize, such is the enormity of Rhee's offense. He has demonstrated that he is not to be trusted. He should be replaced by somebody with a sense of responsibility. If necessary, his whole government should be bundled out." End quote. After much deliberation, it had been decided that staging a coup d'etat against Rhee was not a viable option at this juncture. The South Korean public had overwhelmingly approved of Rhee's gambit, demonstrating that he was too popular for a coup d'etat to work. Still, the South Korean president had clearly demonstrated that he could not be trusted. As Eisenhower remarked, quote, "How can UN forces conduct the defense of South Korea while ignorant of what ROK forces in their rear will do next? If the UNC cannot trust Rhee, how can we continue to provide ammunition for ROK forces when we have no idea what their next move will be?" End quote. Given Rhee's popularity in the South, along with the communists' indication that they were willing to carry on with the negotiations regardless of the whole debacle, the only option that appeared to be open was to somehow force the South Korean president's compliance. Washington, D.C., entrusted this task to a delegation led by Walter Robertson, the Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. His deputy, U. Alexis Johnson, said that Robertson had been chosen for this assignment because, quote, "In Robertson, Rhee had met his match. Garrulous, earthly, charming as it was possible to be, Robert could outtalk even Rhee, and his voice had the kind of soothing richness that could tame even this crotchety megalomaniac." End quote. Over the course of several days, Rhee met with the American delegation an unknown number of times. It isn't certain what exactly was discussed in these meetings. Some inferences can be made based on statements made by American officials during this time. On July 6th, the new commander of the United States 8th Army announced that plans were being made for, quote, "the withdrawal of American and British divisions from the battle line with or without the cooperation of the South Korean Army in the event of a truce being signed with the Communists." End quote. The implication in this being, of course, that the other nations of the UN coalition would honor Rhee's wishes and leave the South Koreans to continue the war alone into the bitter end. The Americans essentially called Rhee's bluff, and it produced the intended result. 3 days later, Rhee publicly changed his stance on the armistice, stating that he still refused to sign whatever document resulted from the negotiations. He would no longer work to obstruct the proceedings. Rhee did not emerge from these talks empty-handed. His compliance had come at a price, namely reassurances from the United States of a mutual defense treaty and additional economic and military aid after the war. With this last obstacle now removed, the negotiations proceeded to enter their final stage, while at the front, the Communists undertook one final offensive operation. By initiating the largest battle Korea had seen in 2 years, they hoped to demonstrate to Rhee and the South Koreans that they could not, in fact, fight against the Communists and win, thereby forcing them to abide by the terms of the armistice. The Battle of Cumings, as it came to be known, began on July 13th, with the Communists focusing their attack along the front where the ROK Army held the line. They met with initial success, inflicting over 10,000 casualties and pushing the South Koreans back by 5 miles near Cumings. By the 20th, the Communist advance had been halted by an intense bombardment of UN artillery. Nonetheless, the point had been driven home. As ROK Army General Paik Sun-yup later admitted, quote, "The outcome of the Cumings battle dealt a serious blow to the president's prestige," end quote. And unfortunately, I will have to end the episode here. As I said at the top of the show, I originally intended to press on to the end in all one go of it, but since that would take another hour at the very least, it's for the best that we split that part off and come back to it in the next episode. Again, you can expect the final episode of the Korean War series to be up mid-November, barring any unforeseen complications. Anyway, in the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or anything else you'd like for me to address, please don't hesitate to email me at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter and Facebook, and on the show's website, links to all of which will be available in the episode's description. If you like the show and want to help keep it running, consider purchasing some used books from me on eBay. Link will also be in the episode description. Also, please consider leaving a review for the show on iTunes or whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use. This has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening, as always. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.